I want to talk about ongoing work that I'm doing with Rob Sampson. Rob and I are old friends and colleagues. He is a sociologist at Harvard, and he and I have been working probably the better part of 10 years on a kind of ongoing project that seeks to understand the dynamics of local collective civic participation, of neighborhood civic participation. So this is very much, this particular piece is very much a work in progress, so I'm very keen to hear your feedback and thoughts on it. Rob and I have published a number of pieces out of this kind of ongoing collaboration. One of those appeared in the American Journal of Sociology in 2005, and this particular piece of research that I'm going to report on today grows directly out of that that earlier paper. The piece in 2005, our goal in that was to try to predict variation in kind of the rate or level of local collective civic participation. We have data on 77 discrete neighborhoods in Chicago, massive amounts of data on those neighborhoods, and we added to that data on collective civic events that we coded from the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Defender, which is the major black paper in Chicago. We, again, pulled stories or pulled information about collective civic events out of the stories in the newspaper, and wherever possible, place them into the relevant neighborhood context. You follow? So we were adding to this already elaborate data set we had on the neighborhoods, the Chicago neighborhoods, the levels of collective civic participation from 1970 to 2005. Okay? And again, the goal in that earlier piece, the 2005 article, was to predict variation, neighborhood variation in local collective civic events. That's what we were trying to do. And let me bring up what was the final kind of table from that earlier paper. Basically, we set this up as a kind of comparison between two very different accounts of civic participation or political participation. One that comes somewhat out of a social movements tradition that stresses the role of mobilizing structures, organizations as the principal vehicle for facilitating civic participation. And so that the variable, it's the second to last variable, organizations, that's the density of organizations at the neighborhood level, okay? We were sort of contrasting that account of political life with a more Putnam-esque social capital approach, okay? And the two variables that we were using to kind of operationalize that kind of a social capital approach is the overall level of reported individual memberships in voluntary associations, okay? That's what we mean by memberships. And then above that, a very Putnam-esque variable, reciprocated exchange. This comes out, by the way, off of something called the Chicago Neighborhood Survey, which asked large numbers of residents all over the city in all of these neighborhoods, do you engage in regular reciprocal exchange with your neighbors? Sounds very bowling alone, very, very social capital. That has a negative effect on civic participation. So the more reciprocated exchange, the lower the levels of civic participation. Individual memberships has no predictive effect. The best predictor is the density of organizations. Okay? Again, that was just the main finding that came out of that earlier paper. Now I want to talk about the work we've gone on to do, which builds directly on this. When we kind of finished this piece, we said, okay, organizations, density of organizations appears to predict civic participation. But the question for us then became, well, are all organizations created equal? Are they interchangeable? Are these just kind of structures that can encourage civic participation? Or do they vary? Does the rate of civic participation vary by category of organization? So in the next piece of work, which I'm going to report on today, our goal was to compare two rather important categories of organizations, especially in the context of the United States. I think less so in Europe. Nonprofits, certainly important in Europe. The other are churches. So we wanted to look at the impact, or compare the civic effects of those two categories of organizations. Churches on the one hand, nonprofits on the other. Again, the goals for this next project, the top one I've already mentioned, compare the civic effects of these two categories of organizations. We also had a lot of methodological work to do here to do this research. The organizational data we used in that 2005 paper actually came off the Chicago Neighborhood Survey. So it's not objective organizational data. It's not an organizational census. It's each subject, each interview subject, survey subject, was asked to name all the organizations that were in their neighborhood. And literally, that's how we generated the organizational density measure. It's an interesting measure, but we wanted to replace it with objective information on the organizations, the churches and nonprofits that were in the neighborhood.
I'm an ignorant Dutchman, and I have a kind of idea of what churches are, but what are non-profits? Can you give me some examples of what kind of organizations are you thinking about?
Well, the nonprofits has a certain legal status in the United States, and we pulled the data directly off of the IRS filings. The IRS is the Internal Revenue Service. It's the tax organization. All nonprofits have to be granted a tax-exempt status, so they have to be accorded that status by the tax authority. And then they have to renew, each year they have to renew their nonprofit status by filing. Those filings are a huge data set that are available to scholars.
But can you give me some simple examples of nonprofits?
Foundations would be, as long as they don't engage in political work, foundations, service organizations, the Red Cross. I mean, there's literally thousands of nonprofits of a wide scope. The Parents and Teachers Association, which are school organizations. So any organization that really is sort of broadly promoting the public good, not engaged in political advocacy, you'll lose your nonprofit status if you're engaged in political advocacy. But groups, little leagues, sporting associations, any organizations that's broadly promoting the civic good would typically get nonprofit status in the United States. Does that help? Okay. So, but again, our measure of organizational density in that earlier paper came off of surveys, which is a little odd to generate organizational data that's subjective in nature at root. So we wanted to replace it with more objective organizational data for churches and nonprofits. And I've already mentioned where we got the nonprofit data. These are IRS filings, yearly filings, and we have the entire file, and it lists the address of that organization, so we could geocode it and put it into its appropriate neighborhood context. Does that make sense? Churches, similarly, we had to go through old telephone directories. They're rapidly going, they're not available anymore, but they were still available for the years that of interest to us. And again, so the church would be listed by its address, we geocode it, put it into its neighborhood context. So that was the methodological goals for the project was to